Hello everyone, welcome. It's 13th of October, Tuesday. So welcome back. I'm of course Bill Code and this is my colleague Christina Metz.
Hi, how's it going?
Yeah, so today we said we would talk about addiction, so we're going to try and cover that topic. It's a very huge topic. I've got the 12 pages in my book to it, and I will take a couple of excerpts out of the book because it's really very useful. We're understanding addiction, I think, better and better than we ever were.
Mm-hmm.
It's much more a physiologic brain plasticity issue than we ever thought before. So that's, I think, really exciting. We've moved on from that time when it was felt to be a personality weakness or disorder and so on. But many people are still stuck in that kind of older idea or concept. So now's a good time if you want to have any of your friends join you, and if you want to let them know about it. And of course, we will be transferring it over to my website where you can do it also as an audio podcast only, or you can watch the video. We'll put it up onto a YouTube link so that you can watch it at drbillcode.com. And that's still, I've learned, the best place to purchase my book. I looked online at Amazon and they had the Kindle version for about $9.50 US. But the one that came up was a paperback book used for $183, which is just absolutely nonsense because it's $30 Canadian typically. Shipping is a hassle, but we've got pretty good options to ship within the United States, and in Canada we just pay it and away we go. Anyway, so let's get started on what is addiction. So if you had to capsulize addiction in a sentence or two, how would you describe it?
A lack of control over decisions regarding substances or items or behaviors.
Yeah, I think that's a good one, really, because it's that lack of control that frustrates us, and it of course happens usually gradually, and then all of a sudden we can't do it. So it was written by Dr. Smith, and she did a brilliant article in the National Geographic in 2017, which really caught a lot of people's awareness. I'm going to read you a quote from it, but the essence of the piece is, it's a type of learned behavior to a great degree, and it impinges. So it's a nice parallel for neuropathic pain or chronic pain, because we used to call it wind up, meaning that, say you had shingles on your chest or breast, which is a common lesion for shingles, and the T5 distribution, usually one side, and the pain messages are sent so frequently up to the brain that it kind of burns a pathway. So then the messages are different. Now it's just the air attacking the chest, and the herpes is all healed up, but just the air and the cool or the clothing on the chest can be enough to trigger the pain. And so a phenomenon of wind-up has occurred, or you could call it burning a pathway, because the same happens to a great degree in learning, and the same happens probably to a great degree in addiction. So if you start to see that, then you start to realize that there's modalities that can help with the addiction problem. I read one thing this week. We were talking about CBD last week and cannabis, of course, but the opiate craving response or factor could be reduced by a little over half just with the use of CBD. So I'm not saying that that's a panacea or everything, but it helps us start to be aware where other things can do it. So when I started practice 40 years ago, when I was interning equivalent, then the treatment for alcoholics, when they came in, they put them on a benzodiazepine.
Right.
Which was, great at the time. It tended to reduce their seizures when they're going through seizures from withdrawal from alcohol, but it gave them a whole new addiction. And by the 80s, we'd realized that 70% of alcoholics weren't just alcoholics anymore. They were also addicted to benzodiazepines. Librium, Valium were the big two early ones. And of course, many people have been addicted to the barbiturates. So we've had all these drugs that people are addicted to. When we first started using morphine and heroin in, the Civil War in the United States or wars in Europe, they made many of those people addicts because we didn't realize that opiates were addictive. And so that changed those people's life forever because they, couldn't get along without it. And then eventually it became really controlled. In fact, in one of our provinces in Alberta, here, they were all worried about the opiate addiction because 2/3 of it is initiated by physicians, unfortunately. Mm-hmm. So they eventually kind of put down a dictum that nobody could renew their opiate prescriptions, which was a really nasty disaster because it put all these people into cold turkey withdrawal, which is horrendous and really risky. As any of you have read about withdrawal or maybe you've experienced it yourself, your pulse goes way up, you get very frightened and anxious. Sometimes you're looking for that next fix, but there's all these counteractive things because the body's own responses are not normal. Yeah. So one way I like to think about addiction is if you start to look at it, how we can do it with foods, okay? Mm-hmm. And a popular one we've leaned on a little bit before is gluten and dairy, because either one of those produces a morphine-like substance in the body. It's called caseomorph from casein, which is the cheese piece of milk. And then it's gliadomorph or glutenomorph, some people will call it, but it's a morphine substance produced from gluten. Mm-hmm. So if you talk somebody into it and they say, well, I'm going off gluten, they might go through a very irritable 2 or 3 days because they're literally going through withdrawal because they're not getting their opiate-like substance to the brain the way they're used to. And that's why people don't take my bread or don't take my dairy because we're very responded to that. And that happens in children, although we don't realize that, but it happens in adults too, and then we understand it a little better. So there's probably a chemical component that's making a difference. Like I know there was a nice parallel a few years ago that if you had one beer, that was maybe 1 unit of dopamine, because dopamine is one of the feel-good hormones. It's the one that people jump out of airplanes and climb high hills and take major risks, race car driving, whatever you want to pick, because that's a dopamine rush. You get more dopamine to the brain, you feel awesome, and you feel really good. But you start craving it more and more and more, so you keep doing it. Mm-hmm. And you do more and more dangerous things. And men are particularly bad at that because they really get hooked on it, but some women get very hooked on the dopamine piece too. So if we were taking one beer was 1 unit, and then cocaine, maybe that's 20 or 30 units, and then crystal meth, several hundred units. Mm-hmm. So crystal meth is extremely addicting very quickly. In fact, now in this province, if the parents are on crystal meth, they literally know social services goes and gets the kids. Right. Because they're super at risk. Because when people are in that extreme of addiction, so back to our food addictions, the body will settle. The body will recover and it'll reset without those things, in this case gluten and dairy. But it loops over into other pieces. So one of the other fellow I really like, and I talk about this in my book, I give him full credit, is Gabor Mate. So he's a physician that's worked for years and years on East Vancouver, the Lower East Side, which is the highest concentration probably of opiate addiction and maybe other addictions in Canada, certainly the highest in British Columbia and Alberta. So he worked really hard at that and he got to really understand it. He looked partly within at himself because we all tend to have them. I think Gabor will describe himself as a workaholic. I certainly was through that. It took me with my diagnosis of MS in '96 before I started to figure out that I was a workaholic. I think I had realized that before I left Saskatoon in '92, I'd watched a movie with Harrison Ford called Regarding Henry. So I don't know if you've ever seen that. It's worth a watch though, because this is a fellow, he's a high dynamic lawyer in New York, and he's so addicted to work and all the pieces around it and his status that his life actually improves after he has a brain injury because he gets shot. Okay? So then he resets, starts to look at things, and goes it from there. So I think admitted to my wife Denise that I was a workaholic at that point. And you know, it's interesting how the steps go on within us. But I like Gabor Mate's approach because he wrote a fabulous book called In the Realm of Hungry Ghosts. And the ghosts are what you experience as a child, even pre-memory of, you know, most of us remember back to 3.5, 4, but even things happening before that can make an imprint on us, an impression on us. So I guess a great example would be a mother leaves her child 2-3 hours and the child feels abandoned. And they start to play these tapes. I've been abandoned. What did I do wrong? And all these pieces. And because that's happening pre-memory, it's hard to go back and see what triggered that. Or it might be some other almost PTSD event. Abuse, any of these pieces can be huge triggers for the addiction personality or entity changes within the brain because it burns new pathways as a way of survival. Because the body and the brain, number one, they want to survive. So anything they can do to reduce pain or perceived pain from these tapes or memories that are playing continuously inside is a difference. So, well, how old were you when you had your first memory, thinking back?
I can remember as far back as maybe 3 or 4.
Yeah.
So I remember it because my sister she's 2 years younger than me, and I remember her being able to walk at the time, and I was protecting her. So if she could walk then, I must have been 3 or 4.
3 and a bit.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, for sure. And it was when I went down to Mexico to experience ayahuasca that I had some help and some discussion points from the shamans. And I realized that probably my first memory was being in a hospital, little tiny hospital, of course, what is this, 1956, 57, probably 3.5 years old with pneumonia. Mm. And of course, the treatment in hospitals at that time is you get the parents out of there.
Okay.
Because they just make it unpleasant, so to speak, for the staff working. And they don't visit. They won't let the parents visit the child. So you're getting an intramuscular injection of penicillin, because that was the focus at the time. And sure, it's solved my pneumonia, but it's quite possible that abandonment was the first start of one of my tapes.
Right.
Or memories to remember that. So ayahuasca helped bring that, I think, more to the fore. And that's the advantage of ayahuasca and some of these psilocybin, some of these entities, even though we're starting to understand them better now, and we're actually starting to use them. Mm-hmm. I was at a tremendous discussion point, I think it was 2 years ago, and they were talking very much about addiction, and it was Andrew Weil and Michael Pollan and one of the other researchers, neurologists, I think, was talking very much about they're all different experiences and awareness about treatments and modalities for addiction, because we're getting a much better understanding about it now because we need to move forward in a different way. Mm-hmm. Just taking people away from the addictive problem, that's not a good solution. You're not giving them any favors. I've learned a lot about that with the people working at point of return, of course. And there's a chapter on that in the book, talking about point of return and all their work helping people withdraw off either benzodiazepines, sleep medication are the main ones, and sometimes in selected cases they'll even help people with either antipsychotics or with even opiates to some degree, because they do a lot of one-on-one, online, or telephone counseling, because support systems are really important. And not all of us can afford or get into a big treatment center, for these opiate problems or other problems. So we need to kind of get to a stage where people in the community are aware enough that they just don't trade addictions. As I talked about in the alcohol problem in the 70s and 80s, we would add in Valium and think we'd solve their booze problem.
Right.
But it was a very short-sighted idea.
Yeah. I wonder what sort of comments you would have on the whole AA thing.
Well, AA and the 12 steps, it isn't for everyone. I'll be really honest about that. Some people are vehement against it. I spent 4 years on the Saskatchewan Alcoholism Commission in the early 80s, and one big step we made was change it to the Saskatchewan Alcoholism and Drug Addiction Commission, because it was much more widespread. It wasn't just alcohol. It was all these other agents, and many of them were pharmaceutical prescriptions. Didn't matter. It was an interesting, when I went with two of my colleagues to a small town in Saskatchewan called Hudson Bay, we had people that were quite addicted often to Valium and other things. And of course we'd been heavily coached not to do that, or just do it for a few days and that's it. So, patients are pretty accommodating. They'll figure out something else. So they would drive an hour and a half to see a physician who would prescribe them that.
Right.
But of course, Saskatchewan's a small place. It had the first drug plan in North America, if not in the world. And consequently, we would get a printout every 3 months, all the things that person was on, whether we prescribed them or somebody else did. So we still didn't have a good solution, because awareness and knowing about the addiction is only part of the solution. You've got to figure out how you're going to help them with the next steps. So that's where it's pretty interesting to see what can help. I talk about in the book, I was finished first year medical school, working up in the Whitehorse, Yukon, and it was wonderful to go up there. That's where we were in September, right? Denise and I were in September for almost the entire month up to the Yukon. But up in Whitehorse, I was staying with a first cousin of mine. He was a family doctor, and he wanted to help me learn about addiction. So I describe it, he threw me in on the deep end, meaning he took me to one of his clients. This guy was in his early 50s. He was drinking a 40 ounce, or what's that? It's almost 2 liters. No, it's over a liter of vodka in a day, and he wanted to go into hospital. So I spent 2-3 hours with this fellow. We finally talked him in that he would go into the hospital for detox. And once in hospital, my cousin Don Brannigan used acupuncture to help reduce some of the downsides of withdrawal.
Right.
So I look at acupuncture as helping the body's energy meridians, which early on we quite underestimated within medicine. They're getting a little bit more accepted now, but they're still not totally understood or tolerated. But, many of my anesthesia colleagues and many other family doctors and other people in the country are now using more of acupuncture for some of these items. So it starts to give us one way to go to it. The advantage for me was it got me really acutely aware of addiction problems. So I had a much better listening ear, and maybe that was a piece for why, because I remember being out in general practice in a small town, and finally I get this fellow from Saskatchewan Medical Association. We're looking for a doc from a small town to be on the Saskatchewan Alcoholism Commission. So that meant driving 4 hours to Regina at that point, because that's the capital of Saskatchewan, and we'd have the meetings. But it had a great learning base for me as an early practitioner, simply because half of our meetings would be in Regina in the government building, and the other half were in the treatment centers around Saskatchewan. Saskatchewan's 1 million people, and in those treatment centers around, half the counselors typically were addiction people themselves. They'd been through it, and so they were, quite brilliant. They knew all the pitfalls. They knew all the lies, or, different ideas that people would tell, and they were often based on AA, which you were talking about, in the 12
Right.
steps of AA. One advantage of the AA system is it has a belief in a higher power.
Mm-hmm.
So for some people, that's a great place to go for reserve, times of crisis,
Mm-hmm.
and it takes some of the onus off yourself, that it isn't all your fault, or at least you can get other people to assist you,
Mm-hmm.
and a higher power to believe in. Some people won't buy that at all because they really object to the concept of higher power. Okay, well, that's fair enough. But then you need to find either your cognitive behavioral therapy or some other modality to help you solve that whole issue. Because you can't always do it with things, but if you can do several things, exercise, sometimes some other agent to help you with it. In extreme cases, I've seen a couple of young men very addicted to opiates. They had one time of ibogaine, which is not ayahuasca, but it's in that same general group of herbs from South America. Dramatic. Turned it off. So that starts to help us realize that it's something that will sometimes interrupt that, call it burned in pathway,
Mm-hmm.
addicted issue pathway. So we should check. Are we getting any questions that people want to do for that?
No questions yet, just everyone saying hi, which is
Okay,
nice.
which is good.
Yeah. I guess I have the most experience with AA because I have people in my life who have gone through the AA program for their addictions.
Sure.
And I do see it as being helpful to an extent, but I do wish that there were more of a referral system in place where it's like you were saying, they would also maybe be referred on for cognitive behavioral therapy, or maybe even nutrition, because the reality is, even once you get through that initial stage of withdrawal, you might not feel great for a really long time, and you can kind of speed up that process by working on the nutrition and the microbiome.
Well, and yeah, and we should get to the microbiome in a minute. And I think those are really good comments. AA was initially sort of all there was, okay? And it developed out of that whole time, I'm guessing about the 20s, 1920s, so 100 years ago. But we've learned a great deal since, and I think it's, now we should look at it as just one of the pieces of the puzzle.
Mm-hmm.
And in some centers, the big strength in it is it's always one of the final steps in AA is now supporting others
Mm-hmm.
with their addiction. Because it's one of the corners that you can turn once you have solved it yourself. You really haven't fully got it until you can help others with their problem
Mm-hmm.
and their support system. And the anonymous part has been incredibly important, and they're usually extremely good about that, and I respect that very much, because it's a degree of shaming. When people have addiction, they have a lot of shame, they have a lot of very uncomfortable feelings about themselves, and consequently that's one plus for the AA system. So it's one of the pieces of the puzzle. It's often used in a lot of centers today, but it isn't used in all centers. But you make a good comment about it. We need to move to the other. So why don't we look a little bit at the nutrition microbiome piece?
Mm-hmm.
Because you were telling me earlier, so some of the pieces that you've looked at in the microbiome, for example, alcohol will shift our microbiome.
Mm-hmm. So with alcoholism, we tend to see a decrease in some of the beneficial microbes, the commensal microbes, and an increase in proteobacteria, which tend to include more pathogens and more of those lipopolysaccharide or LPS containing bacteria, which are, so if you remember from previous discussions, LPS is an endotoxin which induces systemic inflammation.
Yeah.
So the research is saying, well, maybe it's this that's playing into the liver issues that people end up having from alcoholism.
Sure, which is a good one. And just while we're on that, I think it's worth talking a bit about it, because I see some people, they're doing 4 ounces, 6 ounces per day. We'll get into that a little bit because we're talking about chronic pain next week, right?
Mm-hmm.
And people sometimes when they're up against it, they will use um, booze or alcohol primarily as their pain treatment modality. And so the pain is consistent, it's there every day, then they're having 4, 6, 8 beer to solve it, and they're well on the road to a liver injury. Liver injury can happen, unfortunately, regular use of 2 drinks in a woman, 3 drinks in a man. So that's a way down from where some people are existing. And the liver will tolerate it for a time, but eventually it'll pack up. But it's very interesting that you tie in the piece with the microbiome, because the LPS, or lipopolysaccharide, is from the gram-negative bacteria, gets it, but it causes huge inflammation. You cause inflammation in the liver chronically over time, it will upset it. Because alcohol can be a poison, as you know. You can drink too much. We used to see this when our kids were in high school. We would have the occasional party here. We'd rather have them partying here where it was safe and so-called other entities. But at that time, some of the kids were clever in the back and beyond, out of your sight. They'd use a funnel.
Okay.
And they'd pour down, a 26 ounce of alcohol, usually vodka in this case, I think. But that's enough to kill people. Because the downside is, if you're just drinking alcohol here in a whiskey format, which is 40%, then you will usually pass out before you drink all of it, okay? But if you pour it in with a funnel, you can get enough to stop breathing and die. Yeah, so it's an interesting sidelight.
Yeah. I've also had the pleasure of doing some microbiome testing on people who are coming out of certain addictions or coming off of periods of time where they've been overusing things like alcohol. And I do tend to see more candida in those with a history of alcoholism. And then with the other drugs, some of them can actually be antimicrobial, and so I do suspect that some of these other drugs are maybe masking underlying issues, and that could have been contributing to why the person liked the drugs in the first place. We did have, so when we did that open house where we had all those physicians come to the Taymount Clinic, we had one physician who was particularly interested in whether what we were doing with the fecal transplants had any impact on people with addiction, and at that time we hadn't had any clients. And it never really it was never something where I was like, oh, we should be maybe marketing this to addiction clients. But we did have one person who volunteered himself, and he did make it part of his treatment protocol. So he did go to a treatment center, went through the whole withdrawal period, and then immediately came to us for the fecal transplants after, and it went really, really well for him.
Well, and sure, and it makes a great deal of sense, doesn't it? We've got that incredible gut-brain axis, so it's another modality that you can access and shift. Not only that, we know there's established microbiomes in the brain, and it can help adjust those. And of course, just as a reminder to everybody, serotonin is 70% produced in the gut and maybe 30% in the brain. Dopamine is 50% in the brain, 50% in the gut. And so all of a sudden, we're realizing why that microbiome and the general well-being within the gut is a huge impact in the whole scenario. And we were talking a little bit earlier about gluten, which makes for a leaky gut, and casein and dairy, which makes for a leaky gut. And yet, we have a relative feel good from those agents because we get a morphine-like substance in the brain. So it's one way of seeing you'll reduce some of those problems if you take away the triggering factors in the food. And I think that's one of the weaknesses in most treatment centers. I imagine there's high-end treatment centers now where the food is really good. And they've got, salads and everything a day. I've read novels where they have amazing food in these super high-end facilities in, be it Arizona, California, it doesn't matter. But it's not a common thing. In the early days, it was like hospitals. The food was just food. Keep them fed, give them enough calories to eat, but it doesn't solve anything. In fact, the addiction to different foods, that ties in. So we've talked about gluten and the others, but what are our favorite things in food? What are our go-to foods when we're stressed or unhappy, so on? Well, then we tend to go for fat,
Mm-hmm.
um,
Salt.
salt, sugar, crunch,
Yeah.
and sour sometimes. So one of the amazing things is potato chips. Of course, because it's got all those things in it. And that's why lots of us go to our comfort foods, because when we're short of different nutrients, we can, enlarge on that a little bit with the B vitamins and so on, but when we're short of particular nutrients, as humans, we don't have enough taste buds. We've got something like 9. There's a cow will have 500 and a dog will have 200. They can search out when they're short of iron or selenium probably and these other features. We can't. We go to our comfort foods.
It's true.
And our comfort foods usually don't do us any favors, but they make us bigger around the middle.
And speaking of those comfort foods, that's something that I'm seeing with some of the people who've been through AA is they just kind of transmute their addiction to one thing onto another thing, and that I've seen it be the comfort foods. So I am thinking that the AA program is not addressing those underlying emotional issues. Or maybe even there still is some sort of physical imbalance where maybe like the hunger hormone and the fullness hormones aren't fully in balance yet or something like that.
Sure, and even B vitamin deficiencies. I mean, it's very striking with alcohol, the extreme of alcohol when you're losing your mind and your brain, Wernicke's psychosis, it's desperately short of a number of B vitamins, and ideally they would give them even intravenously to try and to back those down, but to put that whole piece in a mix to solve it. And I think anybody that's been to a church hall or a community hall where they have AA meetings, you can guarantee there's no end of coffee cups around, and often no end of cigarettes.
And cookies.
Yeah, cookies for starches. Yeah, that's true. Yeah, it's got sweet and it's got starch and it's comfort food.
Yeah.
So, and that's the tricky part. So if we talk about relative addiction of things, and we alluded this a little bit when we were talking about cannabis, cannabis has got about a 9% of addiction, but it's a relatively easier one to treat because the body doesn't get as hooked on it, maybe because the body has its own endocannabinoid system. Whereas you go to tobacco and nicotine, something like 35%, way up there. And opiates, 20, 25, 30%. In fact, fentanyl makes it much higher. Fentanyl is now preferred over heroin by people in the addiction world.
Interesting.
And the tragedy is now we've got carfentanil, which is 1,000,000 times more potent than fentanyl, so it's really hard to control. And so that's why another aggravating feature in opiate overdose. Yeah. So when we talk about opioids, so now we're into a little bit more refined area, but addictions to opioids or alcohol, there's a lot of more similarities than there is unequal parts. The alcohol kills slower. We talked about overdosing on alcohol is pretty tricky to do, fortunately, probably. Although it's the number one social accepted entity, and we still have a bigger crisis on the planet socially from alcohol. I mean, it's been one of my bugbears and everybody else's. Alcohol sales have gone up over the moon. It's like the holiday season around Christmas and New Year's, but it's every day for the last 6 months. And the sales of those. Because when we worked in Saskatchewan, everybody was really happy in the liquor commission because they had big income, right? But if you looked at the income for the government for every dollar you took in for alcohol, you spent $2 and $3 on the social and health consequences of the alcohol. So that's the trade-off, and that's why we need to keep working, because addiction is now accepted by the World Health Organization as a disease, and that's the way we need to look at it, and that's the way we need to try and tease apart the pieces. because you need a multifaceted approach or an integrated approach, diet, counseling, cognitive behavioral therapy, some other variation thereof, and other things that'll help it. So what's one of the new kids on the block to help addiction is the helmet of infrared and near infrared light.
Amazing.
And it is now starting to bring down those opiate issues and so on. So it's painless. I will be showing it to you in several weeks because we have the chapter on photobiomodulation or infrared or red light therapy is one of its new names, just in the vernacular of people. And it's that red light therapy is one of the new issues to try and help us in that whole set of things, and at the same time helping. So one thing we haven't maybe touched base yet, and that's partly because I know I've been leading the discussion, is depression. Okay, huge overlap, because even when I was in medical, 40 years ago, there was known to be an overlap between depression and addiction or alcoholism, especially. In fact, if you have a family history of alcoholism, you can bet your bottom dollar you have a family history of addiction. Okay? And so those two pieces followed day like night or night like day. In fact, one of the interesting things my cousin taught me when I was doing that alcohol treatment up in the Yukon in 1974 was the people on Skid Row, in that time they were using New York as their story, but the people in the down and out section were brighter than average, higher IQs. And so they were some reason part of their life they weren't coping with. They were frustrated, they were depressed, they were sad, and then they turned to alcohol. So that's often a very frequent scenario, and night follows day. And the number one thing on the planet was felt to be depression, and now I think anxiety is right beside it. Maybe anxiety's number, it doesn't matter. They're the same crisis within the brain and throughout the body. So we need to start teasing the whole pieces together. So it's interesting, I've been talking a little bit about Saskatchewan. We got half a dozen people saying they're from different parts of Saskatchewan. Broadview, not too far from where I grew up, and of course Saskatoon, where I trained, and all these other places. So I think maybe one piece to look at would be the correlation between addiction and other health problems. Chronic pain is a really big one. If you can't control your pain, you will do nearly anything which will help circumvent it. So sometimes it's opioids, sometimes it's booze, sometimes it's other pills, especially if it aggravates into not sleeping. So lack of sleep is a tough road to walk down, because almost all the drugs we use to help people sleep have two problems, as we talked a bit about before. A, they don't actually give you good quality sleep, and they don't let you get that deep sleep that you need for the brain to squeeze itself like a sponge and get rid of toxins. And they're virtually all addicting, and most of them work by letting you forget the times that you woke up. So that wasn't any great favor for you. It's working perhaps as an amnestic, but it's not cutting the issue of the other problem.
I would say there's an overlap with schizophrenia as well.
Yeah. Schizophrenia is really tough, and and that's why, I think I said, if I had a young son with schizophrenia, I would really look hard at his diet. And in the short term, if I had to, then I would get him some CBDs from cannabis, because they go head to head with a powerful antipsychotic. And I quoted my book, a study in France where they had one of their new favorite antipsychotics, and they compared it to CBDs, and they both had equal responses, which is pretty amazing, because the CBD had almost no side effects. The downside of our antipsychotic drugs, they're terribly sedating. They make people feel quite dreadful. And so any thinking being, they don't like taking them. Now, they can do an injectable once a month, but that's still a bit of a roller coaster on that. But the other tricky part about, schizophrenia, once you're on that group of drugs, you got a lifelong history written for you. You won't get a job. You probably won't get a partner. Probably won't get a place to live on your own. And it's a tough go.
Mm-hmm.
And those end up, unfortunately, becoming our mentally ill or mental health problems. And these people are on the streets. Tough go.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. One of my pet reasons. I really enjoyed a book written by I think he was originally from Saskatchewan. He decompensated when he was over in Russia working for the CBC, and he said, to solve your problems with addiction, you need three things. You need a home, a job, and a friend.
Mm-hmm.
So, AA is good, but it doesn't necessarily get you all those pieces necessarily.
Mm-hmm.
But the support network, at least it'll help you handle the friend portion. And maybe that will lead into where you can get accommodation. Maybe that'll lead into where you can get work. Because we're getting better now, and we're not supposed to make all those judgments on people, but inevitably people still do. They don't want to take the risk of someone who's got an addicted history if they know about it. And so that's one reason for the anonymity piece, I guess.
Right.
So let's look at the microbiome again. So why don't you talk about some of the ways that we could help counteract that? Of course, bringing down the poison we're taking in, whether it's alcohol or opiates or even the benzodiazepines, they've got some effect too, don't they?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, all of those drugs do have an impact on the microbiome, and so I would definitely recommend making microbiome restoration a piece of addiction recovery once you've gone through the withdrawal process. So I would definitely get people off of the processed foods as quickly as possible. Start switching the different processed foods for real whole food options, especially a lot of different plant foods. And I'm not saying to cut out meat or animal-based foods, because you do need those healthy fats, but just in terms of regrowing the microbiome as quickly as possible, you're going to want a large diversity of different plant-based foods. Because I've seen candida a lot in recovering alcoholics. You're going to want to grow up lactobacillus, which lactobacillus, that genus, they have the ability to suppress candida. And so you're going to want to grow lactobacillus by eating things like kefir or berries or nopal or prickly pear cactus is one of my favorite things. Dragon fruit is another favorite thing. And then there's something you can actually prescribe as well called lactulose.
Okay, sure.
That can actually grow up the lactobacillus.
We use lactulose a lot in the constipated people on a lot of opiates,
Mm-hmm.
because it helps treat that constipation problem, and it solves that sort of whole issue.
Yeah, and then with lowering the proteobacteria, I can talk about that. So
Sure.
Basically, anything that's really rich in tannins is going to be helpful for reducing proteobacteria. So again, you're going to come back to you're going to come back to foods like teas, which are helpful for multiple reasons. So if you think of like green tea, for example, or black tea, those are really rich in tannins.
I'll be right back.
But green tea in particular is also helpful for the microbiome, because it does help to create a more acidic pH. And so you actually want a more acidic, an acidic environment for the gut microbes. So your colon is supposed to be a pH of about 5.5. And so green tea can be one of those things that helps with that. But anyways, back to the tannins. So one of my favorite things to use is pomegranate rind. And then I can think of other things like pine bark. That's another good one. There are so many herbal teas that are basically bark based that are really rich in tannins, and those can all help to reduce the proteobacteria. But then you also have to remove the things that the proteobacteria are feeding on, which does include more of those processed foods, and does include more of the poor quality animal based foods.
Yeah, and so I think in there some of those are a fraction exotic for some people to do.
Mm-hmm.
I admire you. You've done some of those, and I've done a number of them too. But lactobacillus, I mean, we can get it probably from sauerkraut,
Yep, you can also take it in from
yogurt.
Yep.
Maybe we're not doing dairy. If we're not doing dairy, then we're going to do what, coconut-based yogurt?
You can do coconut-based yogurts, or even coconut-based kefir. So you're gonna get the widest diversity if you do something like kefir.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, I mean, the advantage of the lactobacillus and lactobacillus enhancing foods is they're first generation, so they're fresh. The downside of probiotics, I mean, you can do probiotics in short term and it'll get you some benefit from that. But I would rather people used a prebiotic, and one that does increase bifidus, which is our other big friend along with lactobacillus, maybe not as much yeast, is, the, what's the one we use in the little small packets?
Bimuno.
Yeah, Bimuno. So any of those prebiotics, which will help increase the growth of the bacteria within us. The downside of probiotics is they take really healthy first generation probiotics and they put it in a great big vat and they grow out many generations. And so now they've lost most of their so-called wildness. So 2 weeks after you take a good probiotic, it's all gone. It hasn't stayed around. Whereas if you were using sauerkraut and yogurt and kefir and kombucha, I guess, then you're getting younger, healthier, more wild-like bacteria, and they're going to stick around better.
You're also going to be growing up your own endogenous microbes, which is going to be better for you in the long run. Then you don't have to keep spending money on probiotic supplements.
And I think that's why, when we had our gut flora transplant clinic, as we were trained from over in the UK, was that aim for 50 different foods a week, because many of those types of bacteria are within you. There may be a tiny number, but you get their own favorite food, which might be, in this case, broccoli, or it might be, in this case, beets. And all of a sudden, that tiny group of bacteria, it grows up more of its team. So you've got a much more diverse microbiome to hundreds or even thousands of different kinds of bacteria, which is much better than one dominant one. And the most negative dominant one you all know about is C. difficile, or C. diff, or Clostridium difficile. If it gets super dominant, everything goes crazy. And yeast is a bit the same, and of course the old days yeast-free, yeast reduction diets, zero alcohol. Because alcohol really feeds yeast well, and it really kind of takes off.
Yeah, I would also want to know if the reason that the person was using drugs or alcohol in the first place was mood related, and if you know that they have like a reduction in serotonin production, for example, well then modulating the microbiome can also be really helpful for that. So if you think about the types of microbes that produce serotonin or GABA, which is calming, they do tend to be more of the beneficial microbes like the bifidobacteria, the lactobacillus, but then even commensal E. coli. So commensal E. coli is a serotonin producer, and there are a couple of other ones. I won't bore you by trying to pronounce the names, but definitely the more you can grow up your own endogenous beneficial microbes with prebiotics and with a really diverse sort of plant-centric diet, the better your mood is going to be as well.
So, and I think that's hopefully giving you some new choices of how you might approach those mood swings or whatever variation you're struggling with. All of us have times of sadness and depression. Sometimes it's induced by a loss of a job or moving or loss of a spouse or whatever the entity might be. But the more we can work with ourselves so we become easier to heal, I think, and we can feel more empowered to do our own well-being. And that's why, the microbiome awareness, and there's a major chapter in the book and so on it, it really empowers you to make a difference. And you may not need to reach for the antidepressant, or maybe if you're on one, you want to taper off with the help of point of return or on your own. Do it very, very gradually, but bringing these other pieces as you go forward.
And I know we talk about the microbiome a lot with me because that's the background, but now I've got all of these other courses under my belt. And so
Yes.
something else I would also want to look at while we're just on the topic of neurotransmitters and serotonin and GABA would be the other nutritional compounds that contribute to the building of those neurotransmitters and also the breaking down of them. So then we get into talking about methylation, which...
Sure. Yeah, well, methylation is a very big deal. And methylation, well, we can spend a moment or two on it. We'll be at it again when we get to some of the other treatments. But some of us are much more needy for methylfolate, B12, and B6. Those are three big ones that are very key in some people. And some people can't sleep because they have a particular genetic variation, and all of a sudden you give them folate, B6, and B12, they're sleeping. And all their other problems get smaller, because if we're not sleeping, that wrecks anybody in a real big hurry. And I think it's one of the real problem in addicts is optimal proper sleep. So if we can get that. And so what are the other pieces we want to look at in methylation? Because one way is to test it.
Yeah, well, so the B12, the B6, and the B9 will address the genetic variants, so like the MTHFR, the MTR, but then there's a whole other group of compounds that play into that as well, and so choline and glycine are both really important, as is methionine, and then eventually at the very end of the cycle is SAMe.
Yeah, and some people in days past have used SAMe either as an anti-inflammatory or even as an antidepressant. So there's all those pieces along the way, and sometimes just plugging in SAMe actually makes it worse, doesn't it? So you've got to tease out the components and find out where you fit in the system. That's why, talking to someone like yourself or someone well-trained in functional medicine can really help you sort those out. We don't get very much training about those pieces in regular medicine, unfortunately. I'm optimistic the day will come. Integrative medicine is creeping more and more into the curricula in medical schools in Canada, United States, but it's still a new kid on the block, and a new kid on the block doesn't get much space or time. It just is that way because the old kid on the block doesn't want to give their little empire up, and that's pretty natural. That's how things work.
And then if you think about, so there's the psychologist Dr. Daniel Amen. He is using all of these nutritional compounds in his practice as well. So he is doing the tests. He's figuring out which neurotransmitters the person is either they have too little of or too much of, and then using things like SAMe or GABA or even 5-HTP to help balance that person's neurotransmitters. And he does that in combination with hyperbaric oxygen, actually.
Yeah. So hyperbaric oxygen is, and we'll be talking about it more because it's really coming powerful information as far as cognitive ability. And I know we're getting up close to the hour, so I wanted to just read a couple of these, I thought, really excellent quotes, just so that you take addiction and move it into a change in the plasticity of the brain, but a change that can be recovered with neuroplasticity helping. Okay, and so one of these quotes is, this is Dr. Smith, brilliant woman. Addiction hijacks the brain's neural pathways. Scientists are challenging the view that it's a moral failing and researching treatments that could offer an exit from the cycle of desire, binging, and withdrawal that traps tens of millions of people. And then she goes on to another one, and I'll just do part of it. In a sense, addiction is a pathological form of learning. Okay? So if we can learn those, and she compares it to neuropathic and PTSD, and we're going to be talking about both of those. Next week is chronic pain, which is the big one is neuropathic pain, of course. And then in a few weeks, we'll be talking about the PTSD, post-traumatic sensation disorder. Anyway, so to do those pieces, okay. I'm just checking. Oh, interesting, because lactobacillus ruins your home brew, and lactulose is used to sweeten flavor a lot in the UK. Well, there you go. Someone's obviously making their own home brew or variations of beer and wine, which is completely legal anyway. We're not back to the white bathtub gin days yet.
No.
In the days of Prohibition. But there's places talk about it. So I think in summary, what we would like to do today in the chapter in addiction in the book, Solving the Brain Puzzle, really helps you, I think, hopefully understand and empower you to look at yourself or your loved ones. How can we minimize that problem of addiction and help people learn healthy habits and pathways, primarily through nutrition and diet, but also through exercise, cognitive behavioral therapy, acupuncture. I mean, the list goes on and it's very major, even the breathing technique. Each of these allows us to control our own, adrenergic pathway, meaning our highs and lows, our yin and our yang. So as we're able to understand and learn those pieces, then the addiction problem gets smaller and smaller, and eventually it'll be solved. Mm-hmm. So if you bite off small pieces of the apple, but keep eating the apple, you will solve the problem. Mm-hmm. But often we need help, whether that's a functional medicine person helping us along that road, or a psychologist, occasionally a psychiatrist, although it's tough for psychiatrists because a lot of them end up, primarily only pharmaceutically based. But you've got people like Kelly Brogan, who's really coming to the fore now, and all the other choices. You mentioned Daniel Amen with his approaches, and he's got the PET scans and things to show how the changes occur. But our understanding is getting much, much better. So think again of addiction as a neuroplasticity gone wrong, much like a pain pathway gone wrong. And then if you can start to alter the whole dynamics and appreciate that the body would like to heal, but we've got to give it the optimal tools to do that. Mm-hmm. And that's the hard part. But it's not as hard as we once made it out to be.
More hellos. No
okay.
questions.
Yeah, fair enough. So, anything else you wanted to fill in about the microbiome before we...
I don't think so. I think we covered the main things. So I really love that you've rephrased addiction as neuroplasticity. I like that we tied in the emotional component, as well as having support while you're going through addiction recovery, and then these potential sort of health-oriented things that can help you as well speed up the process of just feeling better after you go through withdrawal.
Yeah. So in my personal journey, I had to realize once I got the health bits improved, and a lot of it initially was supplements, and then with changes in diet, sometimes pulling things out like, dairy and gluten, but to discover and find that I had control over those pieces much better, and as a consequence, all the issue of being a workaholic started to solve. I mean, I eventually learned that all my cravings disappeared when I got the nutrition and probably microbiome pieces more correct. Mm-hmm. So that is a very reassuring piece that people need to be kind to themselves, work on the neuroplasticity. You can do part of it with information and knowledge. Part of it is just, gradual effort on your own part, whether that's yoga, exercise, eating a healthy diet, finding what those pieces are for you. Because almost everybody fits into those groups, and that's what fits into the burden of most chronic illness. So what you win in one corner, you will also win in another corner. And your arthritis will get better as you treat your addiction, and all those pieces go along.
Mm-hmm. I think the only thing we're missing from today is having a therapist guide us through a psilocybin journey.
Well, yes, and I think we're a little early for the psilocybin journey, but I think it's coming. I mean, I see it now at meetings.
Yep.
And so that'll be good. We'll go there.
Okay.
At some point. You find us a psilocybin expert, and we'll do it.
I already know a couple.
All right. Well, we'll plan one of those. Okay.
Thanks for watching, everyone.
Thanks for watching. Please share this with your friends on Facebook. If they don't happen to be on Facebook, they can go to drbillcode.com, DRBILLCODE. And this week we're putting on a Spanish version of my book. And this weekend I'm talking at a meeting which was going to be in Mexico City, but of course it's Linka, and it's now going to be on Zoom, of course. And we'll start to work forward, but the focus this weekend is autism spectrum disorder and ADHD, which have their own parallels with all these other issues.
Mm-hmm.
So neuroplasticity is a solution.
Mm-hmm. Next week we'll be back with chronic pain. So don't forget to join us next Tuesday, same time, for an episode on chronic pain.
4 o'clock Pacific on Tuesday the 20th. Bye for now.